Wildlife experts completely baffled. Multiple citizens across the region have been reporting the same creature, describing it in eerily similar terms. What started as isolated incidents has become a pattern that suggests Alaska might be harboring one of North America's most elusive cryptids, the dogman. The footage I'm about to describe came to me through an email from a property owner who wishes to remain anonymous. He's not the only one seeing these creatures. The reports keep coming in, and they all point to the same terrifying conclusion. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. I work as an investigator in Alaska, and I've seen a lot of strange things in my years on the job. Bears doing unusual things, wolves behaving oddly, even the occasional hoax. But nothing prepared me for what crossed my desk last August. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, and the subject line simply read, "Urgent wildlife situation." The sender explained that he'd set up trail cameras on his property about 40 miles outside Fairbanks. He'd been checking the cameras every few weeks, mostly capturing images of moose, bears, and the occasional wolf pack. But on July 15th, one camera activated at 3:47 in the morning. What it recorded stopped him cold. The image shows a creature standing among fallen logs and dense forest undergrowth. The lighting is dim, typical of pre-dawn hours, but the camera's motion sensor had triggered the flash. Two eyes reflected the light directly back at the lens, creating that distinctive eye shine you see in nocturnal animals. But this was no ordinary animal. The creature appears to be standing upright or in a semi-upright position. Its body mass suggests something much larger than a wolf, and the posture is all wrong for a bear. The head is distinctly canine, with a pronounced snout, and what appears to be pointed ears set high on the skull. Dark fur covers the visible portions of the body. What struck me immediately was the way it looked directly at the camera. Not the vacant stare of an animal that accidentally triggered a sensor, but focused attention. The creature seemed to be inspecting the device, studying it. According to the camera's metadata, it remained in frame for approximately 11 seconds before moving off to the right. The property owner wrote that this wasn't his first encounter with such creatures. He'd caught glimpses of similar beings on his land 3 times over the past 2 years. Each sighting involved an upright, canine-like figure, moving through the woods with purpose and intelligence. He emphasized creatures, plural, suggesting multiple individuals. He included a detailed account of his previous sightings. The first happened during a late evening walk along his property line. He'd heard something large moving through the brush parallel to his path. When he turned his flashlight toward the sound, he saw a massive dark shape slip behind a cluster of spruce trees. The movement was fluid and deliberate. The second sighting occurred while he was chopping firewood behind his cabin. He felt the distinct sensation of being watched and looked up to see a figure observing him from approximately 60 yards away. It stood motionless among the trees, partially obscured by shadows. When he took a step toward it, the figure dropped to all fours and vanished into the forest. The third encounter was the most unsettling. He'd been driving home around midnight when his headlights caught something crossing the road ahead. A large, dark form moved from the tree line on one side to the other. It crossed the road in 3 powerful strides before disappearing into the darkness. The height and gait were unlike anything he'd seen before. His email concluded with a statement that has stuck with me. He wrote that he believed Alaska was a hot spot for these creatures, that the vast wilderness and sparse human population created perfect conditions for something large and intelligent to remain hidden. He'd spoken quietly with neighbors who'd also seen things they couldn't explain. Nobody wanted to go on record, but the stories were consistent. I began pulling files and cross-referencing reports. What I found was disturbing in its consistency. Over the past 5 years, at least 17 separate individuals had filed reports about encounters with upright, canine-like creatures in the Alaska region. Most were dismissed or attributed to misidentified bears, but the descriptions matched too closely to ignore. The dogman phenomenon isn't new to North America. Reports of werewolf-like creatures date back centuries, woven into the folklore of indigenous peoples long before European contact. The Inuit have stories of the Adlet, creatures born from the union of a woman and a red dog, said to have the lower body of a canine and the upper body of a human. Further south, Native American tribes across the continent have similar legends. The Navajo speak of skinwalkers, witches, who can transform into animals. The Ojibwe tell of the Wendigo, though that's typically associated with cannibalism and winter starvation rather than wolf-like transformations. But scattered among these well-known legends are quieter stories about wolfmen who walk upright through the forests. The modern dogman phenomenon gained attention in Michigan during the late 1980s. A radio DJ created a song about creature sightings in that state, and the response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people came forward with their own encounters, describing creatures that walked on two legs, had wolf-like heads, and displayed intelligence beyond that of normal animals. Since then, reports have emerged from nearly every state with substantial wilderness. Alaska's vast wilderness makes it an ideal location for any creature that wants to avoid human contact. The state contains over 365 million acres of land, much of it roadless and rarely visited by people. Dense forests, mountain ranges, and tundra provide endless hiding places. If something wanted to remain unseen, Alaska would be the perfect refuge. The climate poses another factor. Alaska's harsh winters and midnight sun summers create an environment where most people stay indoors for significant portions of the year. During the dark winter months, when the sun barely rises and temperatures plummet to deadly lows, few venture far from established settlements. These conditions would allow a creature to move about with minimal risk of detection. I started reaching out to colleagues across the state, asking if they'd heard similar reports. A wildlife officer in Juneau mentioned 2 separate incidents where hunters had reported seeing large, bipedal figures moving through the forest at dusk. Both hunters were experienced outdoorsmen who knew the difference between a bear on its hind legs and something else entirely. They'd both left the area immediately. A state trooper based near Anchorage recalled taking a report from a family who'd been camping in the Chugach National Forest. They'd heard something large moving around their campsite after dark, breathing heavily and occasionally emitting low growls that didn't sound quite like a bear or wolf. When the father shone his flashlight into the trees, he saw a pair of eyes reflecting back at a height of approximately 7 feet. The family packed up and left before dawn. A biologist I know who studies wolf populations shared an interesting observation. She'd been tracking a pack in the interior when she found tracks that puzzled her. They were canine in shape, but significantly larger than any wolf print she'd documented. The stride length suggested a creature walking on 2 legs rather than 4. She'd photographed the prints but never filed an official report, knowing the reaction she'd likely receive. These weren't hysterical people prone to wild stories. They were professionals, trained observers who understood wildlife and wilderness, yet something had frightened or confused them enough to mention it to me when I asked. The pattern was clear, but the explanation remained elusive. I decided to visit the property where the trail camera footage was captured. The drive took me through increasingly remote terrain. Paved roads gave way to gravel, then to rough dirt tracks that required 4-wheel drive. The property sat at the end of a long driveway, surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides and backing up to a ridge that rose several hundred feet. Perfect isolation for someone who valued privacy, and perfect habitat for something that didn't want to be found. The owner met me at the cabin. He was in his 60s, weathered and fit, with the look of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. He walked me to the location where the camera had captured the footage. The spot was approximately 300 yards from the cabin, along a game trail that animals used to access a small creek. The fallen logs visible in the image were still there, though months had passed and snow had come and gone several times. He pointed out where the creature had been standing when the camera triggered. The position gave a clear view of the trail in both directions, suggesting the creature had stopped there deliberately, perhaps to watch for movement along the path. We examined the area for any physical evidence. The ground had been through multiple freeze-thaw cycles since July, making it impossible to find preserved tracks. But the owner pointed out several trees with marks on them, scratches in the bark at heights between 5 and 7 feet. Some appeared fresh, others weathered by time and exposure. He'd found similar marks throughout his property. He showed me 3 other locations where he'd caught glimpses of something unusual. Each spot offered good cover and clear sight lines, places where a predator might watch and wait. One location near the property boundary had a clear view of the main road leading to the cabin. Another overlooked a clearing where deer often grazed in the early morning. The third location disturbed me the most. It was positioned with a direct view of the cabin's back door and windows. Something had been watching the house. The owner admitted this was partly why he'd set up the trail cameras in the first place. He'd felt observed for months before he caught anything on film. That feeling of being watched had grown stronger over time. He told me about the sounds he'd heard on clear nights. Heavy footfalls in the forest, moving with a 2-beat rhythm rather than the 4-beat pattern of a quadruped. Vocalizations that started as wolf-like howls but descended into deeper, more guttural tones. Occasionally something that sounded almost like speech, though the words were incomprehensible if they were words at all. His nearest neighbor lived 2 miles away through dense forest. I made the trip to speak with her. She was hesitant at first, clearly uncomfortable discussing the subject. But when I assured her I was taking the report seriously, she opened up. She'd seen something crossing her property 3 months earlier, just after dawn. It had moved from the tree line toward a storage shed, walking upright like a person but with a distinctly animal profile. She'd watched through her kitchen window as the creature paused at the shed, appeared to sniff the air, then continued toward the forest on the opposite side of her property. The encounter lasted perhaps 30 seconds. She'd called the Alaska State Troopers, but by the time an officer arrived hours later, there was nothing to see. The officer had suggested it was probably a bear, and she'd accepted that explanation because it was easier than believing the alternative. But she didn't believe it was a bear. Bears don't move that way. She'd lived in Alaska her entire life, and knew how bears walked on their hind legs. This had been different, more fluid and natural, as if walking upright was its normal mode of locomotion. The proportions were wrong for a bear too, the body leaner and the limbs longer. She'd kept quiet about it since then, not wanting people to think she was crazy. I drove back to Fairbanks and started digging through historical records. The Alaska State Library had archived newspaper collections going back to the territorial days. I spent hours scrolling through microfilm, looking for any mention of unusual creatures or strange encounters. What I found was remarkable. Reports of wolf men and upright canines appeared sporadically but consistently throughout Alaska's recorded history. An article from 1937 described a prospector near Nome who claimed to have been stalked by something he called a devil dog. He said the creature followed him for 3 days as he worked his claim, always staying just out of clear sight, but making its presence known. He abandoned the claim and never returned, insisting something unnatural lived in those hills. A 1952 edition featured a story about trappers near Bethel who reported losing catch from their trap lines. The animals weren't eaten, just removed and carried away. They'd found tracks that looked like large dog prints, but the stride suggested bipedal movement. The trappers set up a watch one night and heard something moving through the darkness, breathing hard, and occasionally vocalizing in a way that made them too frightened to investigate. A 1973 article mentioned a group of hunters who'd encountered something near Denali. They'd made camp and were sitting around the fire when they heard branches breaking in the forest around them. Multiple sets of eyes reflected their firelight from the darkness, but the positions were too high for wolves. The hunters fired shots into the air, and whatever was out there moved away, but they'd heard footsteps running on 2 legs rather than 4. The indigenous peoples of Alaska have their own traditions regarding such creatures. I spoke with an elder from a village in the interior who was willing to discuss the old stories. He explained that his people had always known about the dog-faced ones, creatures that walked like men but had the heads and appetites of wolves. They were considered dangerous and were avoided whenever possible. The elder said his grandfather had seen one when he was young. The creature had appeared at the edge of their fishing camp one evening, standing upright among the trees and watching them work. His grandfather had spoken a prayer in their language, and the creature had turned and walked away into the forest. After that, his grandfather had always insisted they leave offerings of fish at certain locations before making camp in that area. The tradition of leaving offerings suggested long-term coexistence between the people and these creatures. If the stories were true, both groups had learned to give each other space, to respect boundaries and avoid conflict. But with modern development pushing into previously untouched wilderness, those old agreements might be breaking down. Human presence in formerly remote areas could be forcing encounters that previous generations had avoided through traditional knowledge. I contacted researchers who study other cryptids, trying to understand the broader phenomenon. The Dogman description matches reports from Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, suggesting either multiple populations of the same species or a widespread mythology based on common archetypes. The consistency of descriptions across different regions and different witnesses argues against simple misidentification or hoax. The creatures are typically described as standing between 6 and 8 feet tall when upright. They have muscular builds, powerful limbs, and canine heads with pronounced snouts. The eyes are often described as amber, yellow, or green, and they reflect light intensely in darkness. The behavior is notably intelligent, suggesting problem-solving ability and possibly even language or complex communication. Witnesses consistently report a sense of being observed or followed. The creatures seem to study humans from a distance rather than immediately attacking. This behavior differs from typical predator patterns and suggests curiosity or intelligence assessment. Some researchers theorize these creatures might be evaluating whether humans pose a threat before deciding how to respond. The Alaska reports fit this pattern. Most encounters involve the creature watching humans from a distance, sometimes following them, but rarely approaching closely. Only a handful of reports describe aggressive behavior, and those typically occurred when the witness approached the creature rather than the other way around. This suggests territorial behavior or defensive responses rather than predatory intent. I returned to the original trail camera footage, studying it frame by frame. The creature's posture showed confidence rather than fear. It hadn't been startled by the camera's activation. Instead, it appeared to be examining the device, possibly understanding that the flash meant detection. The fact that it moved away after 11 seconds suggested awareness that it had been photographed and a decision to leave the area. The eyes in the image bothered me most. The reflection showed clear eye shine, common in nocturnal animals with a tapetum lucidum, the reflective layer behind the retina that enhances night vision. But the positioning and focus suggested intelligence, awareness, thought. These weren't the blank eyes of a deer caught in headlights. This was a thinking creature that understood it had been seen. I compiled all the reports I could find and mapped them. The sightings clustered in specific areas, primarily in the interior and western regions of Alaska. The clusters appeared around major river systems and mountain ranges, areas with abundant wildlife and minimal human presence. Several hotspots emerged, locations where multiple encounters had occurred over the years. The property where the trail camera footage was captured sat at the edge of one of these hotspots. Within a 50-mile radius, I documented 12 separate encounters over the past decade. The consistency of location suggested either a resident population or regular movement through the area. If these creatures existed, this region would be prime habitat. I started receiving more emails after word spread that I was taking these reports seriously. A fisherman described seeing something wading through a river at dusk, moving upright through waist-deep water with powerful strokes. A pilot reported spotting a large figure running across a remote valley, moving faster than any bear he'd ever seen. A highway worker mentioned finding massive canine-like prints in soft ground near a construction site. Prints that showed only 4 toes but were far too large for any known wolf. Each report added another piece to the puzzle. Individually, they could be explained away as misidentifications or overactive imaginations, but collectively, they painted a picture of something living in Alaska's wilderness, something large and intelligent that had learned to avoid human contact, while occasionally revealing itself either by accident or by choice. The question of whether these creatures actually exist remains unanswered. I haven't seen one myself, despite spending weeks in areas where sightings have been reported, but the consistency of witness testimony, the quality of the individuals making reports, and the historical record of similar encounters make me hesitant to dismiss the phenomenon entirely. Something is happening in Alaska's wilderness that we don't fully understand. The scientific establishment struggles with cryptid reports because they lack physical evidence that meets rigorous standards. No body has been recovered, no skeleton found, no DNA sample collected that can't be attributed to known species. Critics argue this absence of evidence proves these creatures don't exist, but Alaska's
Another reason why you can't find bodies of dogmans or werewolves, because the pack members take the bodies away. Because they understand a body will expose them and get the public eye on them. You can understand something. Werewolves and dogmans are very intelligent creatures. They've been here before man. They're basically the first creatures ever been made. If you look at all these creatures you hear that way back then when humans just came to be, because they were there. My Uncle Bubba once told me a story right here. You know something's out there in the woods when everything goes quiet. When the woods go quiet, animals disappear. You know the apex predator out there. Not talking about no bear, not talking about no wolf, not talking about no panther, none of that. An apex predator means higher on the food chain than you are. He said when the woods go quiet, the sky bright or dark. There's two options. Either one, it's sizing you up, or two, it's considering you not threatened. And you can notice if you go to certain places in the United States of America, especially where we stay in Windsor, South Carolina, you go on 200. There's a small little strip of road right there. You coming into the 200, you see animals. Once you get in the middle of it, nothing. No birds, no animal signs, no nothing. When you get out there, about a mile and a half of the 200 area, in the Lancaster area, you see the birds, you hear them, all that. See, that right there tells you there's an apex predator in that area. So you don't see no birds, you don't hear no birds, you don't see no animal signs, you don't see no deer tracks, no nothing. Because near the 200 area to Lancaster is a graveyard there, Indian burial ground. A lot of times, dogmans are spotted around burial grounds that have a lot of this bloodshed. Or skinwalkers too. I don't like mentioning those names. I say that right there, but I don't want to say the true name. Because saying the true name of the dogman, skinwalker, brings them to your location. That's why I always wear one of these, because I'm very superstitious about talking about Native American legends. A lot of these sightings are happening because Alaska had a lot of Native American tribes that got killed off during the Russian war between Russian Native Americans and the colonies and everything like that. So dogmans come around areas that has a lot of bloodshed because they drawn to the negative area. They know there's going to be dead bodies there they can eat on, and nobody's going to go there where a lot of bloodshed happens at. So that's why they go around these places like that in the woods, because they know nobody's going to be foolish enough to go in the areas they don't belong. Look at the video.
vast wilderness could hide multiple populations of large animals without them ever coming into regular contact with humans or leaving recoverable remains. Consider that the Bili ape, a population of unusually large chimpanzees in the Congo, wasn't officially documented until 2003, despite local knowledge of their existence for generations. The Saola, a large mammal in Vietnam, wasn't discovered by science until 1992. New species are still being found in remote areas. The absence of official documentation doesn't necessarily mean absence of the creature itself. The behavioral patterns described in dogman encounters suggest a species highly adapted to avoiding detection. If these creatures possess human-level or near-human-level intelligence, they could actively evade documentation. They might understand cameras and avoid them, recognize that leaving remains draws attention, and teach their young to stay away from humans. This would make them extremely difficult to study or prove scientifically. I've spent months investigating these reports, and my conclusion is uncertain but sobering. I cannot prove these creatures exist, but I also cannot dismiss the weight of consistent testimony from credible witnesses. Something is happening in Alaska. Whether it's a flesh and blood creature, a species of North American ape that science hasn't acknowledged, or something else entirely remains unknown. But the encounters continue, and the reports keep coming in. The property owner who sent me the original footage has captured 3 more images since that July morning. Each shows the same area near the game trail. 2 images show nothing unusual, just the expected wildlife. But the third shows a dark figure at the edge of the frame, partially obscured by trees. It's too far away and too poorly lit to make out details. But the shape is wrong for any animal that should be there. He stopped checking the cameras alone. He brings a friend now, someone who can watch his back while he retrieves the memory cards. He's also installed motion-sensitive lights around his cabin and keeps firearms easily accessible. Not because the creature has shown aggression, but because the feeling of being watched has intensified. He knows something is out there, and he's taking precautions. His experience mirrors what other witnesses have described. The initial encounter brings shock and disbelief. Then comes a period of rationalization, trying to explain away what was seen. But as time passes and the encounters continue, acceptance sets in. Something unexplained is sharing the wilderness with them, and they must learn to coexist with it. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game hasn't issued any official statements about these reports. When pressed, officials acknowledge receiving occasional reports of unusual sightings, but maintain they're likely misidentified bears or other known wildlife. No formal investigation has been launched and no resources have been allocated to studying the phenomenon. This is understandable given budget constraints and the lack of physical evidence, but it frustrates witnesses who feel their experiences are being dismissed. I've forwarded all my compiled information to the department with a recommendation that they at least acknowledge the pattern of reports. Even if they can't or won't investigate, documenting the sightings could prove valuable if more concrete evidence eventually emerges. The response was polite but non-committal. They thanked me for my interest and assured me they take all wildlife reports seriously. The question remains, is Alaska a dogman hotspot? Based on the frequency and consistency of reports compared to the state's human population, I'd argue yes. The ratio of encounters to residents is higher here than in most other states where similar creatures have been reported. The vast wilderness provides ideal habitat. The sparse human presence reduces the risk of detection. The abundance of wildlife offers ample food sources for a large predator. Indigenous traditions and historical accounts suggest these creatures have been here far longer than European settlement. If they exist, they're not invaders, but original inhabitants of this land. The increase in modern sightings might reflect human expansion into previously undisturbed areas, rather than an increase in creature population. We're moving into their territory, not the other way around. Climate change could also play a role. As Alaska's climate warms, vegetation patterns shift, and wildlife distributions change. Creatures that once had unlimited wilderness might be finding their habitat shrinking, leading to more encounters with humans. Alternatively, improved trail cameras and other technology might simply be documenting what was always there, but previously went unrecorded. The trail camera footage remains the best evidence I've encountered. The image is clear enough to show details, but ambiguous enough to avoid definitive identification. Believers see a dogman. Skeptics see a bear or a trick of light and shadow. The truth lies somewhere in that ambiguity, waiting for more evidence to tip the scales one way or another. I've presented my findings to colleagues and the responses have been mixed. Some are intrigued and want to learn more. Others are dismissive, pointing out the lack of physical evidence and the